Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this dual fuel champion generator. I made a video on this recently after this engine dropped a valve at about a year old. When it did that, it took out the piston, the connecting rod, the head, and of course the valve. So, at the time I had looked into rebuilding that engine, but I wasn't able to find all the parts. And the parts that I did find were somewhat borderline as far as cost goes. I wasn't sure it made sense. So instead, I repowered this generator with a less powerful Honda GX390. And this got the machine up and running. We load tested it successfully up to 6,000 watts, and I was ready to call this thing done. Well, as soon as that video released, John reached out, who is a subscriber that also happens to be a champion dealer. And he offered to get me the parts needed to rebuild that engine. So I sent him a list of parts, and within a few days, the parts showed up. So, he didn't charge any markup. He actually just sent it to me at his cost. Really, he just wanted to see this engine made right. So today, we're going to rebuild this Champion 458cc engine. We'll test it out, and if things look good, we might swap it back onto the original machine. So let me set up a little bit better and get going on this. I've already done a lot of the prep work to get this thing back together. Last week, I published a video on a Powermate generator, and that ended up being a really easy fix. So I spent the second half of that video doing some prep work. We honed the cylinder, cleaned the gasket off, and we also put the head together. The new head was a bare head, so we had to transfer everything over, plus a few new parts, like some new valves. So, we're pretty much ready to get this back together, but I didn't take the old gasket off. And technically, this came off extremely clean. It could be reused, but I do have a brand new one. So I'm going to take this off. We'll just clean up the mating surface, and then we'll start putting this together. So we've got a brand new piston, connecting rod, wrist pin, circlips, and piston rings. So before getting this together, let's just check the end gap on the rings. So we want to make sure we have at least 0.03 of an inch for every inch of bore. In this case, this bore is 3.5 inches. So the minimum gap should be 11/1000 of an inch. And looking at that, it does look pretty tight. So let's check an 11. 11 fits. So we are above the minimum. Let's try a 15. And a 15 does not fit. So we have a nice tight gap, but not too tight. Let's do the same check for number 2. Usually the gap on the second ring is a little bit bigger. And yeah, it definitely looks bigger. So we'll just start with a 15. It's bigger than a 15. We're getting close, but it is bigger than 20. Yeah, it's at 22. So not ideal. I'd say it's still in spec. Of course, you want it to be as tight as possible without causing damage, because the tighter it is, the higher the compression and the less oil is going to be burnt. In this case, these rings are safe to install, and I think they'll run the engine pretty well. So we'll start by getting the connecting rod installed. One thing to note is that the arrow points down, and you also want the dipper pointing down. So the orientation should be like that. I've already installed one circlip right there. So all we need to do is get a little lube on the wrist pin and these journals and put it all together. Okay, good. Circlip is installed, and I'm actually going to take off this piece right here. This dipper, it can break off real easy, and I don't want to accidentally break it off when installing the piston rings. Plus, has to come off anyway for installation into the engine. So we'll start with the bottom ring. The bottom one's actually made up of 3 different rings. So you want to make sure this one, which is the oil expander, doesn't overlap on top of itself. So we'll set that like that. And then these rings, one goes on each side, and you do want to stagger the gaps. I stagger the bottom 3 rings at 20 degrees. And then the middle ring and the top ring, I do those at 180 degrees out from each other. So the other rings, they do have writing on one side and not the other. So generally the writing side should go up. And as far as which one is number 1 and number 2, usually number 1 is the chrome one. But I did also take a close look at it to see if there's a bevel. And the bevel for the number 1 ring should be on the top, and the bevel on the number 2 ring should be on the bottom. In this case, number 2 doesn't have any bevel at all. But this ring with the writing up has the bevel on the top. So this is definitely number 1. But let's get number 2 first. Then we'll get number 1 on. All right, and then number 1. Get this all oiled up. Make sure you work it in. a little bit here on the bottom. And we also want some oil on the skirts. The cylinder, I've already oiled it. So we'll get the spring compressor out and we'll get this installed. I've already oiled up the ball bearing. We got plenty of assembly lube on both the connecting rod and the main journal. This counterbalance weight has a timing mark right there, which corresponds to the mark right there. So it's important to line these up not only to keep balance, but this weight right here can collide with that weight if things aren't timed correctly. Yeah, it looks like we're lined up. Now we need to rotate the engine again. The timing mark for the camshaft is in a different spot. So once we get that aligned, we'll install the lifters and then the camshaft. We'll just rotate the engine around a couple times, make sure everything spins well. The bottom end, it is complete. I do want to get the head on next, but I can't quite do that yet. Last week we spent some time building up this new head. It came with nothing. So we transferred over the heat shield, the studs for the exhaust and the intake, and we installed brand new valves as well as keepers. But the one thing I didn't have that I overlooked was the valve stem steel. I did not order a new one, so I put the old one in on the intake valve, but I now have a new seal. So I want to get this installed before getting the head on the machine. Just get a little bit of oil on the new seal. Getting these keepers on, it can be a bit tricky. So I use grease to help it stick in place. You also want to note that one side is thinner than the other. The thinner side goes down. I forgot the rockers, they have to be removed in order to get the head bolts in. The head bolts, they get torqued to 29 foot-pounds. I'm going to bring it up to 18 to start, and then we'll finish it off at 29. Before we get the push rods in, we need to put the rotator cap on. You know, not all engines have this. Some have it on one valve, but not the other. This one has it on both. So I'm using a bit of grease to help hold it in because there is an oil drain down there, and theoretically that rotator cap, if it were to fall down there, it might make its way into the bottom end. So we're going to have to be careful here. I'm just backing off the adjuster. Makes it a little bit easier to get the push rod in. According to Champion, the intake should be set to 5/1000ths of an inch, plus or minus a thousandth. And the exhaust, 7/1000ths, plus or minus the same. So I'm rotating the engine right now, looking at the valves to find top dead center of the compression stroke. So now the intake's opening and the piston's going down. Now the piston is coming back up. Both valves are closed. And I can see the piston's right at the top. I'm going to turn it just a touch past. And now we can set these valves. Yep, so 5/1000ths is tight. Now it fits with a bit of drag. So we'll lock that down and double check it. Yeah, now we're just a little bit tight. Five thousandths fits. And a 6 does not. So the intake is good. So let's set the exhaust to 7/1000ths. Seven fits, has a little bit of drag. And 8 also fits. So that's on the upper side of the spec, but it's pretty tight. You know, as long as the 9 doesn't fit, we're in pretty good shape. And the 9 does not fit. And make sure when you install this fan that it's installed properly. It's actually keyed, and it can only go on one way. And you'll know if it's not right because it won't sit down properly. But like that, it's right against the flywheel. And same thing for the cup. There is a hole right there, and it's keyed. So you want to make sure you align that. Gonna get some oil back in this engine because we are getting close to being able to start this. And I get a little bit excited, and I don't want to do something stupid like start this rebuilt engine without any oil in it. Yeah, this has really good compression. So it's actually pretty hard to rotate it through the compression stroke. So we have compression, and the leak down is minimal. You see how the flywheel bounces back? That's a good quick and dirty test to check what the leak down is, which is basically just a measure of how quickly the compression leaks out of the cylinder. If you have bad valves, bad rings, then there's not going to be a real stop or a bounce back like we're seeing. So this engine, I think it's going to run really well once we get it fully back together. Yeah, right now the coil, it's pulled all the way back. We need to set the gap to 0.010 of an inch. So put the magnet right into the coil and put a business card in there, which will act as a feeler gauge to set it to the correct gap. And then you just loosen the bolts, and the magnet should pull it tight, and then you just snug up the bolts. As far as the carburetor goes, I am going to be using the dual fuel carb that's on the Champion right now when we install the engine. But for testing, I'm just going to use a plain old carb that only runs on gasoline. Now, this carb, I have no idea what machine it came from. Likely it was a GX390 or a clone of one. So it might be a little bit underjetted for this size engine, which isn't really an issue. We can add a little bit of choke. Really, I just want to get the engine running so that I can hear it and make sure that it sounds good. So let's get the bowl off and just make sure this carb is usable. Bolt looks nice and clean, and so does the carb. So this might be a new carburetor. Regardless, given the condition of it, I think this is going to run well. At least good enough to test with. I'm going to take some of the spring tension off. There's no reason to start this up right at 3,600 RPM. That should be good. I've already got the positive connected to the start solenoid in the battery. And I'm just going to add the ground, or the negative, where one end connects to really anywhere on the engine. And the other end just goes on the negative on the battery. All right, let's try this starter out real quick. So we are connected up to the battery, so we have full-time positive coming over to here. And when this is energized, it connects this wire to that one, sending the 12 volts to the starter, which will engage the flywheel. Now to trigger it, they are a little different depending upon what solenoid you have. There are 3 post or 4 post solenoids. All of them have these 2 main posts for the battery positive and the feed running to the starter. The only difference is where the solenoid picks up its negative. In this case, this is a single post to energize the solenoid. So it actually picks up battery negative from the block, and it just goes right through into that solenoid. And the only wire we have has to be connected to positive to trigger this solenoid. So we can touch it over to the battery, or we can touch it to the post over here, which is full-time positive. So let's try it. Very nice. So let's get the exhaust on, and I think we'll be ready to try this out. I think we're looking pretty good. The carb is full of fuel and the needle is holding steady. Now, this carburetor, it is meant for an auto choke setup. Usually the choke has a detent to hold it open, but this one doesn't have that. So we're gonna have to keep an eye on it and just make sure it doesn't close while we're trying to test. As far as the exhaust goes, it went on without issue. I did have to add the end housing just to support the exhaust properly. The only thing of concern here is actually the tire. You can see the exhaust exits kind of against the wheel, and it won't take long to melt this tire. So we're gonna have to keep a close eye on that. Usually the wheels are on the heavier side, which is the generator side. But in Champion's case, for this engine setup, they actually put the wheels on the other side, which makes sense given the placement of that exhaust. As far as the electrical goes, not much has changed. There's not a whole lot hooked up other than the starter. To shut the engine down, we're going to have to manually ground out the coil against the block. Oil sensor is not connected, and the electric start is wired the same way. So let me get you set up a little bit better. We'll hit the electric start, and hopefully we hear a good running engine. All right, choke is on. Here goes nothing. Contact. Yeah, I'm always a little bit nervous after a rebuild. You put a lot of time and effort into something, and if you do something wrong, then it may all be for nothing. But in this case, we're looking pretty good because as soon as I hit that electric start, this thing sprung right to life. The engine was running perfect, and it sounded really good. No funny noises, no knocking. So I dare say, I think this rebuild is complete. So I am going to give this a few minutes to cool down, and then I want to pull this engine off the test frame, and we're going to put it back where it belongs, on the Champion frame. to get the engine back where it belongs, we need to pull off pretty much everything that is on this frame. So I'm going to get the tank out of the way first. Then we need to pull the exhaust, the generator, and then finally the engine. And then we can start putting it back together. A lot of these connectors, they can only be plugged in one way. But for stuff like this, make sure you take note. In this case, the colors happen to align, but not all generators have matching colors. It's not always white to white, red to red. So if there's any question, take a picture, document it before you disconnect everything. I was hoping it would come off that easy. Hopefully the rotor will come out just as easy. This has not been assembled for too long. So usually they come apart without too much of a fight. going to get this starter recoil off because to torque down the rotor, I have to hold the engine still. So I'm going to put a socket on the flywheel nut to keep the engine from rotating. I just pulled the spark plug out so there's no compression fighting us. An important step here is to turn the engine over before going any further with this build. You want to make sure the engine rotates freely. You know, sometimes the alignment's off and the engine either won't spin at all or it spins, but the rotor makes contact with the stator. And there can't be any interference or that generator's not going to last. So let's pull it over a few times and just make sure everything is good. Yeah, it looks like we're good. The engine rotates without issue. There's no funny noises, so I think we are clear to finish this up. So we're getting pretty close. We just have the dual fuel carb to put back on here. Then we connect a few wires and we should be ready for contact. Gonna put the original airbox back on. You know, we couldn't use it with the Honda. It just wouldn't fit. But since we're back to the original engine, we might as well bring it all back to original. And just a few wires left here. So the starter solenoid, this was on the Honda that we pulled off of here. It was originally, though, on the Champion because it has a wire harness that's compatible with this control panel. So with this solenoid, we don't have to splice any wires together. So the wire harness for the solenoid just plugs in right here. We also have this white wire, which is a charge wire. That one comes down from the control panel. Which is right there. Then we have the low oil sensor, which plugs in right there. So we've got battery positive running up to the solenoid. The negative just connects to the block. Really anywhere is fine, but right here is probably the easiest spot. You can't see it, but the kill wire has been connected. And last but not least, we have the power for the electric start. Well, with the exception of the tank, this is fully back together. So I just topped off the carburetor with fuel. I've plugged in the kilowatt as well as the light, and I want to give this a quick test. You know, we've tested the engine, we know it's good, and now that we have all the wiring back together, I just want to make sure that everything functions the way that it should. Yeah, I think we're looking pretty good. The engine started right up. It sounded great. And that light came on right away. The voltage was almost dead on at 121 volts. Now the engine speed, though, it was slow, but I think I'm going to leave it like that for now. We do need to break in this engine, and we don't need to do it at full speed. So I'm thinking, let's finish this up. We'll get the tank on, we'll roll this thing outside, break the engine in properly, and then we'll put it to the test. So before we can load test this using the load bank, we do need to break the engine in. So I'm going to get it started. I will adjust the speed closer to 60 hertz, and then I'm going to run it for a couple hours with a light 1500 watt load. Once that's complete, we'll shut it down, we will change the oil, and then I'm going to do it again, except the second time it'll be at twice the load, 3000 watts for another 2 hours. We'll change the oil again, and then at that point, we should be ready to hook this up to the load bank. We just passed the 2 hour mark, so I'm going to take the load off. We'll give the engine a few minutes to cool down, and then we'll change the oil. Yeah, there's definitely metallic in that oil and a bit of glitter, so usually not something you like seeing, but given that this was a freshly rebuilt engine and it's being broken in, that's the thing you see sometimes. So that's why it's important to break the engine in and change the oil a couple times so you don't let little bits of metal circulate in the engine any longer than you have to. Anyway, let's get it refilled and finish the break-in process. Don't have a ton of sunlight left, so I'm going to try to run this for another 2 hours, but I have a feeling it might get cut a little bit short. And the camera makes it look a lot lighter than it really is, but the sun has set. And I think I'm out of time. So we'll turn the load off and check the oil. Oh yeah, that looks a lot better. Not that you can see, it's kind of dark. So, yeah, I saved the other pan. I'll bring this one inside and we'll just compare the two. The oil on the left, that is from the first 2 hours of running. And the stuff on the right, that is what we just drained from the engine. You know, from looking at it, you can see that this one has a slightly gray tint to it. And if you mix it up, you can see there is metal in that oil. And there are a couple sparkles. So yeah, not great. The second batch is better. It definitely has a better tint, no sparkles. But if you mix it up, you can still see there is a bit of metal in there. So I think we're going to need to run this for at least another hour before doing the load test. Like before, we're going to apply a 3,000 watt load and let it run for an hour or two. So it's been about an hour and a half. You know, I think we're as broken in as we're going to get. So I'm going to take the load off and let it cool down. We'll change the oil one last time. It's interesting too that without a load, we're running at about 62 hertz, but with a 3,000 watt load, we're slowing down to about 58. So the governor droop, it does seem a little bit excessive. We might need to look into that a bit. That oil looks really nice. I hope this comes across, but this oil change is a million times better than the first one we did. This oil is very clean, so I think we're ready for the load test. It's the moment of truth. This machine originally could pull 8,000 watts, and when we repowered it with the Honda we maxed out at 6,000 watts. So of course, my hope is that the original rebuilt engine can power its rated load of 8,000 watts. So that we will find out in a minute using the load bank. But before I do any testing, there is one problem that needs to be sorted out. And I noticed the engine response to a load during the break-in wasn't that good, and I could really see the issue the last time we ran this. The engine was cold. I started it without a load. We started at around 55, maybe 56 hertz, and that quickly ramped up as the engine warmed to about 60 hertz. And by the end of the testing, the no-load speed had actually come up even more to 61.5 hertz, which doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, the governor should maintain that speed under the same load conditions, and we're not seeing that. So what I'm thinking is that, we might have some stuff down here that's misadjusted. After I rebuilt this, I did take some of the spring tension off the governor to slow the engine down. And although I put some of that tension back on, I didn't completely put the tension back to where it should be. So the engine should still be running slow, but the fact that it's ramping up its speed actually tells me that the governor is actually more or less bypassed. What I'm thinking is that the spring tension is so weak that the internal governor just is pushing the throttle plate against the idle set screw. And that set screw is actually turned out quite a bit, about 4 turns out, which doesn't seem like a lot. But without a load, that's almost 60 hertz. And a cold engine requires more fuel to get the same amount of speed. So what I'm thinking is going on here is that, this throttle plate is more or less against the idle set screw the whole time. And when the engine's cold, that translates into about 55 or 56 hertz. And once the engine is fully warmed up, that same position on the throttle plate is 61.5 hertz. So I'm going to get this engine started. We'll just let it warm up a little bit. I'll show you how the speed kind of ramps up as the engine warms up. And then I'm going to back out that idle set screw almost all the way. We'll make some adjustments to the governor spring to get back to where we should be. And then I think we'll be good to go. I think I misjudged this one. Backing off that idle set screw did not seem to solve the problem. Right now, though, we are at about 61.5 hertz. But if I put a load on it, watch the engine speed. 2,000 watts. It slowly got back up to about 60. 4,000 watts, you can see we're at about 56 hertz now. So there's way too much governor droop. So I'm going to shut it down. Potentially we need to move where that governor spring is. This one has me scratching my head a little bit. It's not the idle set screw. That is not the issue. The governor is just not very responsive. It's allowing way too much droop. So really the only thing here that we can adjust is actually the position of the spring. There's actually 2 holes on that governor arm, and right now it's on the outer hole, which is how this engine was. So it was put back together exactly how it came apart. So moving that in might correct the problem, or it might cause another problem. You know, if that spring is too close, it's going to cause an oscillation in the governor. But given the response I'm seeing now, I'm thinking that is definitely worth a try. So I'm going to take the tension off the spring. And this might be tough to do with the tank on, but I'm going to try to unhook the spring from down here, and we'll just move it one hole closer to the shaft. All right, it's back on the governor arm, one hole closer. So it should be more responsive to a load. Question is it responsive enough? Or is it now too responsive? So let's get it started. We'll set the speed again, and we'll try a 4,000 watt load and just see what the response looks like. And just to show you the adjustment I made on a different engine that you could actually see what's going on. Now, this is not a Champion Honda clone engine. This is actually a Briggs, but it's the same concept. You have the governor rod, which connects over to the carburetor. That controls the throttle position. You have the governor shaft, which goes into the engine. And then you have the governor arm with a spring. And where that spring is determines how sensitive that engine is to a load, meaning how well does it maintain the engine speed. The further the spring is away from the shaft, the less responsive it is. So ideally, you would move it closer to get a better response. But if you move it too close, the engine will actually start surging, where the governor is oscillating between the spring force and the force of the internal governor. So on the engine out there, there's only two positions for that spring, and it was in the position that was furthest away from the shaft. So now it's the closer position. So we'll get the engine started, see if it makes any bit of difference. So this time without a load, the engine speed seems a little bit more stable. So I'm hoping that adjustment fixed the issue. Anyway, without a load, we're starting at 3.6% THD. And the sine wave's a little bit jagged. So let's try a half load of 4,000 watts while keeping an eye on the engine speed. You know, right now we're at about 62 hertz. 2,000 watts. It's at about 60, and under 4,000 watts, about 58 hertz. So yeah, not a great governor response so far. 10.5% THD. The sine wave looks pretty good. So we'll give that a few minutes, and then we'll go for the max of 8,000 watts. So no issues holding the 4,000 watts other than the engine speed is borderline too slow. So let's bump it up slowly to the max. So we'll add another 2,000 watts. So we're at 6,000 watts, about 55 hertz. 7,000 watts, 7,500 watts, 8,000 watts. So it's doing it, but the engine speed's kind of slow at about 52.5 hertz. So I'm going to take some of that load off. This is making me a little nervous. So under this kind of a load, we're at 11.6% THD, and the sine wave looks more or less unchanged. So let's give this a few minutes, and then we'll take the load off and let it cool down. Yeah, no issues holding at 7,000 watts. And the engine actually has plenty of power despite the fact that the speed is drooping so much. Anyway, we'll give this a couple minutes to cool down, and then we'll shut it down. Yeah, not exactly the result I was hoping for here. Though the engine starts easily, sounds good, and the generator's making a consistent 121 volts, the governor is not doing a good job maintaining that speed. You know, despite backing out that idle set screw all the way and moving the spring to the closest position possible on the governor arm, maximizing the sensitivity, we still have a lot of governor droop. Under 8,000 watts, which thankfully it could pull, the engine speed did drop to about 52 hertz. So I backed that off to 7,000 watts. Speed came up a bit to 54 hertz. And then I manually opened up that throttle plate and had no problems getting the engine back up to 60 hertz. So we are not down on horsepower. It just seems to be a governor problem. So I guess the big question is this a feature or a flaw? You know, unfortunately, I haven't run one of these engines before, and this one, well, was previously blown up and then rebuilt. So I'm not sure if it's a good example, but there is a chance that all these models suffer from this problem. I'm not sure. Anyway, I've done everything I can. There is really nothing more I can do. So, you know, I think we'll do one more test, but this time using propane. Let's try this again, more or less the same test, except this time running on propane. Now on propane, this machine is going to lose about 10% of its horsepower. So 7,000 watts is pretty much the max we're going to see. And no issues getting the engine started on propane, and it actually sounds like it's running quite a bit smoother as well. So though I'm optimistic that the governor's going to respond better, you know, it should be independent of the fuel source. So I don't think we're going to see it improve, but we can hope. So let's start with about a 3,000 watt load. We're at 60 hertz. Now about 59 hertz, under 3,000 watts, 9.1% THD. The sine wave looks pretty decent, so we'll give that a couple minutes, and then we'll bring it up to 7,000 watts. no issues at all handling the 3000 watts. So let's swap 1000 for a 2. So now we're at 4000 watts. Engine speed is right around 57.5 hertz. Let's try 6000 watts. Yeah, it's doing it, but we're having the same engine speed problems. So under 6000 watts, 11% THD, sine wave, pretty similar to how it was on gasoline. So let's try bumping it up to the max of 7000 watts. That's 6500, 7000. And it's doing it at about 54 hertz. THD, 11%, and sine wave is unchanged. So I'm going to take the load off, we'll let it cool down, and then we'll shut it down. So no issues at all running on propane, with the exception of the governor droop issue. That isn't going to change based on the fuel that you run. But the engine itself, it is running well. It's making plenty of horsepower. Really, we just have a governor issue. That said though, I can't identify any defect in the way this thing is set up. So maybe it is a feature of this model. I'm not sure. But it does have me second guessing pulling out that Honda. You know, though the Honda was limited in that it could only produce 6000 watts, it could do so while maintaining the proper speed. Anyway, at the end of the day, we took an engine that was more or less scrap, made it good again, and now this is back to its original condition. So I wanted to thank John. You know, without his help, I don't think I would have been able to source the parts to make this happen. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.